All right. Um, Thank you, everybody, for picking your language. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We are here to talk about floodplains. The city of Austin is in the process of updating the floodplains across the city. And so we are going to talk you through what that process is. Our presentation is a little bit on the long side. I would say it's a little over 30 to 40 minutes. So we'll run through the presentation, and after that, we will open the floor up to questions. I realize I completely forgot to introduce myself. My name there is across the screen. I'm Stephanie Lott. I'm with the City of Austin's Watershed Protection Department with their Communications and Engagement Office. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Watershed Protection Department, just briefly as an introduction. We're a department of the City of Austin, and we work on flooding, erosion, and water pollution concerns. Most of our funding does come from the drainage charge that's on your utility bill. We are in the process right now of updating our strategic plan. So I want to encourage everyone, if you are interested and have the time, to go to that website, rain2riveratx.com, to provide us feedback and take a survey. We are looking at if we need to how we want to prioritize projects, what types of programs we should be doing, and we would really appreciate the feedback of everyone in this room. With that, I think I want to introduce the people who are going to be doing this presentation. So Karl McArthur is one of our engineers. He's heading up this project to update the floodplains, and he's going to be doing the presentation and probably will answer almost all of the questions that get asked out loud. But we also have people working behind the scenes today. We have Katina, Jameson, and Vicky, and they are going to be answering questions in the Q&A. I think they might have the hardest job because we tend to get a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Yes, we do.
All right, I think I can hand that over to you, Karl.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. So again, my name's Karl McArthur. I'm the supervising engineer for the Modeling and Floodplain Office section within the Watershed Protection Department, and the lead for these floodplain studies, along with Katina Borer, who's helping answer the questions behind the scene. So I'm going to walk you through what we're doing for these studies, why we're doing them, the timeline that we're following to get them done. I think, as we've mentioned in the material we've sent out and in other places, this is an introductory meeting to the studies. We're just starting them. We don't have any floodplain mapping results to show yet. We'll have those later on, and we'll talk about the timeline for that as we get further into the presentation. So today it's just about what we're doing for the studies, why we're doing them, how long it's going to take us, and how they might affect you when they're done. So again, the why, the where, the how, and the when of the studies. From how they might affect you perspective, we'll be talking about flood safety and what we use these models for and how we try to use them to come up with solutions for flood risk problems and to communicate that flood risk to the public. We'll talk about development rules associated with the floodplains, and we'll also touch on flood insurance requirements and how these studies may affect that, and then wrap up with the Q&A, as Stephanie mentioned. Starting off with the why, we periodically update the floodplains for a number of reasons. The big reason this time is a recent publication by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA, called Atlas 14. And that was published in September 2018. And NOAA has been going around the country updating extreme rainfall data information. So that's the rainfall data that we use to design storm drain systems and what goes into the models that we use to develop the floodplains. And so we adopted that new rainfall data. That new rainfall data shows higher intensity, larger rainfall than we had been using previously. So that's the big driving factor behind these floodplain studies. So in November of 2019, we adopted that new rainfall data. We also, in the interim, until these studies are done, adopted the FEMA 500-year floodplain as the city's regulatory floodplain, because the new rainfall is pretty close to what the old 500-year rainfall was. So it's a good surrogate until we have the new models and maps for our updated 100-year floodplain. Quick note about the terminology we're using when we say 100-year rainfall or flood event. That's an event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So it's not you have a 100-year rainfall, it's another 100 years until you have another one. In any given year, there's a 1% chance that you will see that rainfall. And that's kind of borne out with some of the events we've seen in Austin over the past decade or so, with the Halloween 2013 flood, the Halloween 2015 flood, the May 2016 flooding. Each of those was probably right around a 100-year event, maybe a little larger, but located in slightly different parts of the city. So generally, we don't expect a 100-year event to cover the entire city. It's usually going to be in one part of it, but it's not an event that occurs every 100 years. It could occur in any given year. A little more about the why we're updating them. As part of the floodplain study process, we develop a set of computer models that tell us what the flow is and how high the water gets. And then we use that for a variety of purposes to understand the flood risk, to communicate that risk. Developers use it to design their developments to ensure that they're safe from flooding. We use them internally to help come up with flood risk mitigation projects. Of course, we'll have updated floodplain maps as a result of the study. There'll be a variety of supporting data, both for use in prioritizing flood risk areas and projects, and for helping us to communicate flood risk to the public. And then ultimately, there will be updated FEMA flood insurance rate maps. And that's the point at which flood insurance requirements start to be impacted. And I'll talk about that when we get to the timeline. So again, the goal is not to make bigger floodplains so it's more of a burden to everybody. That is certainly not our goal. The goal is to provide the best understanding possible of what the flood risk is to the residents of the city of Austin. So we want to communicate that risk. We want to use these floodplains as part of our regulatory toolbox to make sure new development isn't built that's at flood risk. So we don't want to make any new problems. We've got enough old problems to solve already. And then again, we use these tools to help us figure out what we can do to reduce the risk of flooding. And that's not always an easy task, and it's generally an expensive one. We do try to do as many projects as we can to help reduce the risk of flooding. To give you a feel for the fact that we do update floodplain studies fairly frequently for a variety of reasons. This is a list of some of the more recent floodplain studies and the date that the studies became effective FEMA maps. And you can see there's a fair gap between when we finish the study and when FEMA publishes maps. Talk about that more on the insurance implications. But there's a variety of reasons we update studies. The big one here is the rainfall data. We also update them as we have new and better topographic data. We use aerial flights to collect topographic data. We use that in our modelings, supplemented by other information. So as we get newer, better information, we want to update our models with that as well. To give you an idea of what we're studying, essentially, if you're in the city of Austin or the city of Austin's extraterritorial jurisdiction, we are studying every single floodplain in that area. And that includes both streams where we currently have floodplain mapping and a fair number of streams where we do not currently have mapping. And in this image here, that's reflected by the blue streams where we have current mapping and the orange streams where we don't currently have mapping. This is a huge area. It's a lot to study. It's over 1,200 miles of floodplain. So we've broken it up into several major study areas. Study areas 1 and 2 started about a year earlier than the studies we're talking about today. So they're underway. We had a public meeting, a similar meeting to this in June of last year to talk about that one. And that recording and the presentation is already up on our website. Are eager and want to check that out. The ones we're focused on today are study areas 3 through 7. So that's essentially everything outside of the Onion Creek watershed. And you can see that this is focused on the city of Austin. There's some city of Austin area that's in Williamson County. Williamson County is doing a similar study. There'll be new floodplain information up there. Hayes County will be doing a study as well. So we'll fill in the gaps at the upstream ends of Onion Creek and Barton Creek. So all the communities in the area essentially have adopted the new Alice 14 rainfall and are doing studies to incorporate that information. So we'll have pretty comprehensive coverage of the entire greater Austin area when we're all said and done. Talk a little bit more about the how. How is this study funded primarily? Again, it's a big study, a lot going on, total cost of about 19 million. The funding for the study is broken out between 2 grants from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that facilitates the process of getting us to new flood insurance rate maps when we're all said and done with that. They're contributing 2.45 million. The Texas Water Development Board is contributing a big chunk through the flood infrastructure funding grant, total of 4.45 million. I'll play a little video with our project manager with the Texas Water Development Board so they can tell you a little bit more about that program that's helping fund a big chunk of our study. And then the City of Austin contribution from the drainage charges, essentially, of about 12 million. So I am going to play the video from our Water Development Board project manager.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Jackson, and I am the manager of the Flood Protection Planning Grants Department here at the Texas Water Development Board. I also have the privilege of being the TWDB PM for the City of Austin's Central Texas Regional Floodplain Studies project. As many of you know, this project is partially funded by the TWDB's Flood Infrastructure Fund grant. The intent of the 5th grant is to fund projects to identify flood risk and solutions to that flood risk. This project in particular is updating all the City of Austin's floodplain maps to the most recent rainfall data, which is an essential part of floodplain management. We're extremely excited to get this kicked off, and I am personally interested to see the project's progress over the next few years. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, I'm going to drill down a little more into the specific study areas, starting with study area 3. So this is basically the urban core of the City of Austin from I-35 out to the west up to just downstream of Lake Travis. We're not studying the streams that drain directly into Lake Travis. We start essentially just downstream of Mansfield Dam. That includes Walnut Creek, Shoal Creek, a lot of the Bull Creek, a lot of the familiar names of watersheds around the city. This study area affects the City of Austin and Travis County. Study area 4, that's primarily south of the Colorado River, south of Lady Bird Lake and Lake Austin, goes again from the urban core right around I-35 to the west up until just downstream of Mansfield Dam. Includes Barton Creek, Eanes Creek, East and West Bolden, and a variety of others. This will impact portions of Sunset Valley, City of Westlake Hills, City of Rollingwood, City of Bee Cave, a little bit of the City of Lakeway, and of course Austin and Travis County. Study area 5, primarily to the southeast, so south of the Colorado River again, basically from I-35 to the east. Includes Country Club East and West, Carson Creek, Dry Creek East, and some various other tributaries. Dry Creek is the watershed that contains the Circuit of the Americas track, as a point of reference for where that is to the southeast. This study affects Austin, Travis County, Creedmoor, and Mustang Ridge. Study area 6, this is kind of in the inner part of Austin from I-35 to the east and then north, and includes Boggy Creek, which includes Fort and Tannehill branches, and Walnut Creek, which includes Little Walnut and Buttermilk. This one affects Austin and Travis County. And then the last one, study area 7, a little further to the east. This is primarily the Gilliland Creek watershed, including Harris Branch, Decker Creek, Elm Creek. This one will affect Austin, Travis County, Bastrop County. Let's see, a little bit of Weberville, Manor, Pflugerville, and Round Rock. We'll dive a little bit more into how we go about doing these studies. First, starting off with survey. So this gets back to the topographic data that I was talking about. So we combine that detailed aerial topographic data that we collect with on-the-ground field survey and use that information to tell us how big the creek is, how big the floodplain is, and build our models from that. A point on survey, I mentioned we're just starting studies 3 through 7, so it's quite likely that we'll have survey crews out and about all over town over the next few months. In some cases, they might ask you for access to your property if we need to survey a cross-section in that area. We would certainly encourage you to cooperate with them and let them do that. It'll be a fairly quick process, not invasive at all. They just need to go in and survey the shape of the creek. We also survey at bridges and culverts. And then hydrology, that is the determination of how much water gets to the creek. So we use that topographic data, land use data, a variety of other things to help us build models that predict how much water gets to the creeks. Once we have those numbers, we go to the hydraulics. So that represents the shape of the creek and the floodplain, and based on how much water gets there, lets us determine how high the water gets, how far it spreads out into the floodplain and over the banks of the creek. And that leads to the last step, which is mapping. So taking that topographic data, the results from our hydraulic modeling, and then drawing those floodplain maps so that we can have that flood and risk information, put it on maps, make it available to the public. One quick point about how we regulate floodplains in the city of Austin. 2 types of floodplain maps that we use for FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency purposes, on those flood insurance rate maps. The floodplains there are based on existing conditions within the watersheds that we're studying. So what's on the ground now? What level of development is there as it exists today? For our regulatory purposes, so what we use to govern how development happens in or near the floodplain, we use what we call fully developed floodplain maps. So for those, we assume development out to the maximum allowed by zoning or ordinance or whatever controls the maximum amount of land use in a watershed. So that represents what it could ultimately be, and that's what we use to regulate within the city. A little note on timing relative to those 2 sets of floodplains. So once we're done with the studies, we've finalized the modeling, and you will have an opportunity to see the preliminary floodplain maps before we do finalize them. We'll have another set of public meetings for that. But once we do go through that process, finalize our studies, have our completed, fully developed condition models, we will start using that for regulatory purposes. So we'll put that information up on our FloodPro website. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that's what will be used to regulate development. With those existing condition models and mapping, we'll submit that to FEMA, and it'll take them, generally it takes 2 to 3 years for them to go through the lengthy process that they have to follow to ultimately produce new flood insurance rate maps. And at that point, it'll start impacting flood insurance requirements. Through that FEMA process, there's another opportunity for public appeals and comments on the map. So it won't be just when we have preliminary maps, but before they become effective for flood insurance purposes, you'll get another chance to look at them. As most of you probably know, flooding doesn't just happen from the creeks. These studies are focused on the creeks. We do have other planned studies and other studies ongoing that look at areas that aren't necessarily drained by a creek, so areas drained by storm drains. There's some significant flooding problems in many areas of town based on that flooding where our storm drains don't have sufficient capacity. A lot of neighborhoods were built before the city had a drainage criteria manual that governs how drainage systems need to be built. First edition of that was published in 1977. So those older neighborhoods often have undersized drainage systems, have localized flooding issues. The image that's showing on this slide, hopefully you're seeing it, down at the bottom, there's a hatched area. That's the upstream end of the Hempill branch of Waller Creek. We are studying that as part of our floodplain study. All the rest of it that has different shades of blue, that's localized flooding from water that doesn't get into the storm drain systems. We are not studying that as part of these floodplain studies, but again, we have other studies ongoing or on the way that will look at those flood risk in those areas so that we can better communicate that to people. We won't necessarily regulate to that flooding information, but it gives us information to share with you and to use for figuring out what to do to fix those areas. Talked about the fact that floodplains do change over time. So I'm going to show you some quick examples in the Williamson Creek watershed of how that floodplain has changed over time. Again, our current regulatory floodplain with those Atlas 14 changes is the FEMA 500 year. We expect these new floodplains that we're delineating to generally be a little smaller than that. They may be bigger than that in some areas, but generally a little smaller than what we're seeing with the FEMA 500-year floodplains. And of course, as I mentioned previously, there'll be areas that we previously didn't have floodplain maps where we will have them. So some of you may find that you're next to a mapped floodplain. There's always been a floodplain there, but there might not have been a map showing that previously. So this is the middle portion of Williamson Creek, South Austin. There's Stastny Lane, Manchac Road. This is the 1981 version of the floodplain, the 2000 version. See, as we go along, there's little changes here and there, depending on the newest topographic data and other information. 2008 floodplain. This is what we're using as the current regulatory. So this is the FEMA 500-year floodplain. And we have an ongoing study to look at options to reduce flood risk in the area. So we do have an Atlas 14 version of the floodplain in this area, and that's what that one shows. So you can see in some areas it gets a little bigger. Most areas it gets a little smaller than that 500 year. All right, talking about timeline. Again, for study areas 3 through 7, we are just past the study initiation phase. We have 5 consulting teams that all have their marching orders and are actively working on the studies, but we're still near the beginning. The survey that I talked about, we expect that to be complete around fall of 2023. The actual floodplain modeling, so our hydrologic and hydraulic model, figuring out how much flow we get and what it does when it gets to the creek. We expect that to be done fall of 2024. Floodplain mapping completed. We expect that to be in spring of 2025. So sometime toward the end of 2024, early 2025 is likely when we'll have our next round of public meetings where we have preliminary floodplain maps to show you. And again, once we're done, we start using those for regulatory purposes. We submit them to FEMA, and then it's a 2 to 3 year process before new flood insurance rate maps are completed. Now I want to talk a little bit about our study website. I'm sure a number of you have gone to that website to register for this virtual public meeting that we're having today. So hopefully you're familiar with it. You can go to that website to see where we are in our studies. We have some information that lets you know how far along we are in our studies. We'll periodically put additional information there. As I mentioned, we have the recording and PDF of the presentation from our June 20th, 2022 meeting for study areas 1 and 2 already posted on that website. The recording for this meeting and the PDF, or for one of our 3 meetings that we've had, will also be posted on that website. And there is an interactive map there that you can go to and see if you're close to a stream that is being studied as part of the study effort. Drilling down into that a little bit. Once you go to that interactive map, you can enter your address, and then it'll show you where you are relative to streams we are studying. So if you're next to a blue stream, that's a stream that already has a mapped floodplain, and we'll be updating it as part of this study. And then if you enter your address and you show up next to an orange stream, that's one that has not previously had a mapped floodplain, but will as a result of this study. There's always been a floodplain there because there's always been a creek there. It just hasn't been shown on a map. It will be now, so that may impact properties along those creeks in various ways. We'll talk about that a little more in regulation and insurance. Also on that website, we have a video that kind of goes through, again, what the floodplain study process is, provides some different information to what I'm telling you today, has some cool and kind of scary flooding videos and imagery. So I recommend you check out that video. It's relatively short, provides some good information to supplement what we're talking about here today. Also, as part of our outreach effort, we've been sending mail outs for the first 2 study areas. We sent about 50,000 mail outs. For study areas 3 through 7, we sent about 150,000 mail outs. And the way we determine who we send those to is we took the current floodplains, buffered out a little bit on either side of those to identify all the potentially impacted properties or the streams where we currently have floodplains. For the streams that are going to be studied this time and will have newly mapped floodplains, we used the stream layers and the city's critical water quality zone to identify which properties may be affected by those. And when we send out the mailers, we send it to both the property owner and the current occupant. So for apartments, rentals, we should be getting both the occupant of the property that may be impacted and the owner of it if the owner is different from the current occupant. And just a quick note on those mailouts. Some of them on the Spanish side had the subject property address incorrect. So if you look on the English side, the subject property address line is always the correct one. So hopefully that didn't confuse too many people, but there's a fair number of those that went out. So look at the English side to verify the property address the letter is intended to go to. All right, so how you may be affected. Flood safety and preparedness, that's one of our key goals and our mantras is to make sure people are aware of their flood risk and prepared in the event of a flood if one does occur. So again, we're not seeking to make burdensome things by mapping the floodplains. We're trying to inform you of your risk and give us tools to help figure out what to do about it. Development rules, there are obviously limitations as to what you can do in the floodplain. You have to meet certain restrictions. In some cases, it may be difficult, if not impossible, to build on a property in a floodplain. And we can certainly work with people on that. Also, it'll affect flood insurance. If your home or business is in a mapped floodplain, a FEMA mapped floodplain, it does trigger the requirements for flood insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage. Unfortunately, this definitely will affect some people. Some people may have to get flood insurance as a result of this that may not already have it. And again, our goals are to better understand and communicate that flood risk, not to make your life more difficult, and to provide us with tools to help us figure out how to reduce that risk and make things better where we can. So again, flood safety and preparedness is a big thing that we like to emphasize. This slide has a number of resources to help with that, starting off with atxfloodpro.com. So that's a web mapping application that has our current floodplain mapping, lets you find out based on our current mapping what your flood risk might be. And I'll give an example of that here after we get to the end of this. Also, if you have or are interested in purchasing flood insurance and want more information about that, we would encourage you to go to the floodsmart.gov website or talk directly to your insurance agent. They will know a lot more about the implications of it than we will here, but we can certainly help point you in the right direction. We suggest that you make an emergency kit so you're ready in the event of a flood. So these maps show that you are at risk of flooding, and then you find out that severe weather's on the way. It helps to be prepared just in case. And we've got some guidance on how to do that. Staying informed, the city has an atxfloodsafety.com website that has links to a lot of different ways that you can stay informed of potential flood risks, weather situations, information about what's happening during an event. So the warncentraltexas.gov site is a place that you can go register yourself to get warnings about potential severe storms, flood warnings, flood watches. It'll pass along information from the National Weather Service and a variety of other sources. So it'll give you an idea of what might be coming your way. And our atxfloods.com website is the site that has real-time information about streets and crossings that are affected by ongoing flooding. So if you need to go somewhere during a flood or a rain event, which we certainly encourage you to stay where you are in most cases, but if you need to go somewhere, you can take a look at that to see which roads might be blocked. And then finally, knowing your neighbors is always a good thing, especially in a flood event or any other natural disaster. Knowing your neighbors that aren't in the floodplain so that you have a place to go, knowing your neighbors so that you can inform each other and help each other during an event is also certainly encouraged. So for regulations and development, there's stricter rules for development in the floodplain. You have to meet a variety of requirements, one being freeboard. So freeboard is the difference between the regulatory flood elevation and the first living floor of a house or building. So the city requires 2 feet of freeboard across the board, or across the entirety of the city, if you're going to be developing a property that's partially in the floodplain. Other requirements related to that, you can't build an ADU if your property is in the floodplain on a single family lot. So our goal there is to minimize flooding impacts to the community. We don't want to make new problems, because in the end, when there's damage, when we have to do things to mitigate, the entire community has to foot the bill for that. So we want to make sure we've got enough current problems. We don't want to have any new ones if we can at all avoid it. Again, flood insurance, if your home or business is in a regulatory floodplain. So once we get through this process, FEMA makes the new maps. If your home or business is in that and you have a federally backed mortgage, you would have to have flood insurance. We certainly encourage anybody that thinks they're at risk. And again, we've talked about risk that's outside of creeks. You don't have to be in a creek to flood. You can be in one of those localized flooding areas and have problems. Flood insurance works the same way there, but you probably have a lower rate if you're in one of those areas. So we certainly encourage folks to purchase and maintain flood insurance. Also, if you're in one of those areas that's to be mapped, FEMA has a newly mapped program. If you buy your flood insurance before the maps become effective, you get a break on your rate for at least a few years. It will incrementally increase up to the full actuarial amount. And that would also apply to anybody that currently has a flood insurance policy. If your risk goes up, it would increment over a few years to that full rate. And again, we encourage you to talk to your insurance agent if you have further questions about flood insurance, or go to floodsmart.gov. There's a lot of good information there. And that's it for our part of the presentation. Now we'll open it up for Q&A, and Stephanie will talk a little bit about that process.
So I think the first person is Angela Garza. I'm going to go ahead and I'll allow you to talk.
Hi. First of all, thank you for doing this and educating us about this. I am a native of Austin, Texas. We do have my grandparents' home that was originally here before anything was built here. But since then, I'm also the co-chair for the East MLK Combined Contact Team in the area. We've had quite a few improvements that we've negotiated, like rain recaptures and things like that. Somebody was supposed to come out yesterday in East Austin to come to our home to do an assessment if we could actually amend the flood map, because we can, because it's only a small corner that's stuck in a 25-year plan. Also, I've done enough research to know that there's a difference between what you can get approved for in development between a 100-year floodplain, 500 floodplain, 500-year floodplain, and a 25-year floodplain. What we're trying to get ourselves out of is a 25-year floodplain. So here's my question. My question is, how do we go about, don't wait for these maps to come in, but also amend because we know the improvements that we've done in the area now. And my other question is, talk about the ADU part. This is the first time we're hearing about that an ADU cannot be built on our property at all. This is like, we've never heard this in our entire lives in Austin, Texas. Could you please elaborate a little more on that as well?
Okay.
Oh, one more question. The biggest barrier in the area is that a lot of our families in vulnerable areas, like the Boggy Creek shed in number 6, is that they cannot get to flood insurance because they're expecting flood insurance to be paid in full and in amount. That is their biggest barrier. What can we do to help the vulnerable area actually pay in payments on flood insurance so that they can get covered? Because what people don't understand, I did my research on this, is 20 to 30% or more people on flood insurance do not actually live in flood insurance planes that actually get covered for that flood insurance. And you have to have that for FEMA to help you. So if you would clarify all that, that would be awesome. Thank you so much.
We might need you to remind us of if we've missed one of those questions. Karl, before you go ahead and answer, I just wanted to explain for the whole audience, in case they aren't familiar, when we say ADU, we mean accessory dwelling unit. In other words, if you build like a second small structure on your lot to rent out or have your in-laws live there or for other purposes. All right, I will let Karl take over now.
All right, we'll start with the first part about changing floodplains. You mentioned improvements on the property. Hopefully those were permitted improvements. To get changes to the 25-year floodplain, which is a City of Austin regulatory thing, that's not a FEMA thing, you need to go through the permitting process to get those approved, show that you're not impacting others by whatever improvements are done. If you're putting fill on the lot to take the area out of the floodplain, adverse impacts can take the form of both increasing water surface on a neighbor and reducing the amount of floodplain storage. Hopefully when you're talking about improvements, it's gone through the permitting process. Otherwise, it would have to in order to change the situation on your property. As far as FEMA floodplains,
absolutely, yes.
As far as FEMA floodplains, there are ways to get your property, or your home at least, or your property out of the floodplain. The first is a letter of map amendment. So if you're on the fringe of the floodplain and your house really isn't in it, even though it shows the floodplain touching it, there's a way to go through FEMA to provide elevation information about your property and your home to get your home taken out of the floodplain, which would get you out of the requirements for flood insurance. The other way to change it is a letter of map revision, which would require, so a letter of map amendment is going to require a surveyor to go out and survey elevations on your home and the adjacent ground. A letter of map revision actually changes the floodplain map. That would require an engineer. You'd need survey data to justify whatever the change would be. You can go through that process to change the FEMA maps. That's a more expensive process. So for dealing with the city's 25-year, probably need to go through a permitting process for whatever improvements you want to do there. Then moving on to accessory dwelling units. So if your property is in the floodplain, we don't allow you to add additional dwelling units. A lot of people are interested in building ADUs to supplement their income, for house another family member, whatever reason. But those aren't allowed in the floodplain. And that's been the case for many years based on the city's code, that 80 additional dwelling units are not allowed on a property that's in the floodplain. And then the last question, remind me what your last one was. Oh, flood insurance. Okay.
Oh, no, real quick. Going back to that 25-year, you're talking about the 25-year, right? Is that correct? For the
Yes.
city of Austin? Okay, so once we get it out of that 25-year, we'll get to that after that, right?
You can't put an accessory dwelling unit in the 100-year either.
You can or cannot?
Cannot.
And 100-year plane?
Not in the 100-year floodplain, no.
Okay, that's what I need to know. Thank you.
And then as far as flood insurance goes, the requirements for flood insurance are based on whether your home or business is in the mapped FEMA floodplain. The insurance companies or the mortgage companies use determination companies to go in, look at the maps, figure out if your home is in or out of the floodplain to determine whether or not you have to have flood insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage. Obviously, flood insurance can be a significant cost, especially if you're close to the creeks. The city has really no control over flood insurance requirements. That's strictly a FEMA mortgage company thing. There's been discussion in the past about how the city could help out with that, but we haven't come up with any workable solution for that yet. So we do try to do projects that mitigate that flood risk whenever we can, but again, they take time, they're expensive. We have a lot of problems and we can't fix all the problems in the city in any kind of short time horizon. It'll take us a long time if we can ever get there to fix all the problems. That's probably not a fully satisfactory answer to some of those questions, but covers most of it, I think.
I will go ahead and add on the flood insurance part that was part of the reason we talked about the rain to river process at the beginning of the meeting. Like if you would like to see more assistance with flood insurance, that is something that could be suggested in that survey. It doesn't mean we're able to do it, but it means we would know that there is a desire out there for it. And that was rain2riveratx.com.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good place to go to provide input now. And there will be a continuing public input process for that. So talk more about those kind of things as the process goes along.
Did we get all of your questions answered? Because you had several of them. So I want to make sure we didn't miss any of them in there.
Oh, no, you did wonderful. Because we also know, because we are actually grandfathered with a lot of, it tells me how I need to design my property because we're grandfathered if we leave one wall up or anything like that. So we've been here all our lives. So now I understand why it's important that we understand how to be grandfathered. So thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Just real quickly, grandfathering is generally not a thing for flood risk, but with the Atlas 14 ordinances that we passed, there is a residential redevelopment exception. If you have an existing home in the floodplain that doesn't meet the requirements of our code, you can tear it down and rebuild so that it does meet all the code except what we call safe access.
Oh, really?
So that's one of the main things that has in the past forced people to go to council if they wanted to rebuild a home that's in the floodplain. So you've got to meet all the other rules. You got to have the freeboard, so your finished floor has to be 2 feet above the regulatory flood elevation. You have to show that you're not causing an adverse impact on others. But yes.
Oh my gosh, that is awesome. Can you send us a link to that, please? That is amazing.
I'll let Jameson and Katina answer that in the chat.
Thank you so much. That is amazing. Thank you.
That would probably be, if you could go ahead, I think you've emailed me before, go ahead and email me that and we'll send you what we have.
If you're seeing the screen, this is that atxfloodplains.com website. When we have it ready, it'll be posted up here at the top of the website. And again, you can scroll down. There's the video I mentioned that kind of explains the process. This stuff tells you where we are in the process. This is the interactive map that I showed. So you can type your address in here to see if you're near a stream that's being studied. Here tells you the status of our studies that needs to be updated. And if you scroll all the way down, there's links to, this is the June 2022 meeting that I talked about. You get the slides and watch that meeting. It's very similar to this one. And then some other resources down at the bottom. And I also wanted to talk briefly while others formulate some questions about our FloodPro website. So this is where you go to figure out if your home or property is in or near one of our currently mapped floodplains. So this is what it looks like when you get there. You can say, I want to find flood information, type in your address, see what your flood risk might be. Also, down here at the bottom, if you click on layers, you'll get a map legend that tells you what you're looking at. So it defaults to the fully developed condition floodplains, so the FEMA regulatory floodplain, or so the city's regulatory floodplains. And you can also show what the FEMA floodplains look like. All that blue is the Colorado River floodplain over there. So it tells you what the different colors you're looking at are.
Carl, we do have another question. So Abigail Rutledge, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. I do not live within the city of Boston. I actually live in an ETJ, an extraterritorial jurisdiction. And I did receive a letter of map amendment 7 years ago when a portion of the land that we're on was next to a wet weather creek. And because we were refinancing at the time, we were asking us to have to get, flood insurance. And I was like, oh my gosh, but anyhow, I did go through that process. I learned a lot. If I need to still monitor that, it's the atxfloodplain.com website that will help me monitor if my LOMA is still relevant, or is all of that still going to be revised through FEMA, or so I just have to monitor them? I'm not really sure as for myself.
Okay. So right now, to see what the floodplain, hopefully I got all your question there. It was hard to hear you at times. But
I'm sorry.
sorry. To see what your current flood risk is, atxfloodpro.com is the place to go. To see what's going on with our studies now, atxfloodplains.com is the place to go. And then if you have an existing letter of map amendment, as we get to the FEMA process, there's a validation stage. So FEMA, in this case, their contractor, will go through and look at every single letter of map amendment in the areas that's being studied, determine if it's still valid based on the new floodplain information, and we'll come out with a list of revalidated LOMAs at that time. So that comes fairly late in the process when we're getting close to having FEMA produce the new flood insurance rate maps. As we go along with the studies, we will, and get to the point where we have preliminary floodplain maps, we will make those available. I'm not sure if it'll be on FloodPro or on our ATX Floodplains website. But again, we'll have another set of public meetings. We'll do another set of mail outs once we're getting close to that point, and share where you can go to see that information in addition to our public meetings. So hopefully that covered your question.
Okay, and then I think Angela Garza, I believe you have another question. So if you want to go ahead and ask.
Yes. Again, thank you for doing this. Oh my gosh, yeah, I just want to jump into the sky. I'm so happy about this meeting. So all the work that we have been doing as a community over the years is important work, because we have been trying to do so much flood mitigation. And the more that we can get our folks out of this flood area, the more that we will actually, what I'm hearing, the more we'll have the opportunities to go ahead and create our ADUs, which people need that additional income in the area for rent. And also we can get them out of expensive floodplain rates, because our flood insurance rates, because doesn't be based on the way the flood insurance works, doesn't it get more expensive if you're like in a 25-year plane versus a 100-year plane, or the 500-year plane? And that's what becomes expensive for our families in Austin, Texas. And I'm sorry I have to speak like this, but I'm one of the natives with the grandparents who came in that built from the ground up here in Austin, Texas. And a lot of our families are original families that have been here since the 1950s. So it's important that we really understand how to move forward with this. Are also, one more question. Are you going to have all this in Spanish for our Spanish speakers to be able to read and access?
Yeah, so we will have a Spanish translation of the presentation. If y'all heard me at the very beginning of this saying I can't do it, I was trying to record a Spanish version with another computer sitting beside me, but I was getting lots of feedback and I didn't get that done. So I don't know that we'll have a Spanish version of the presentation available. We certainly will have the English recording of it. Flood insurance. So FEMA, fairly recently, within the past year or so, has changed how they calculate the flood risk related to flood insurance rates. So it's not the way it used to be. If you're in the 100-year, if you're in the 500-year, it's a different rate. There's no longer any preferred risk, which was what it was called when you were in the 500-year floodplain and had an insurance policy. They have a completely different way of coming up with that risk. Honestly, I don't fully understand all the mechanisms of it because they haven't published exactly how they do it to my satisfaction, but that is a tool that FEMA has to come up with the risk and the risk rating for determination of the policy amounts. So we try to get our models and maps to be as accurate to what the actual risk is as we can, so that we're not over predicting things. But ultimately, it's FEMA's tools that determine the risk rating for any given property. So it's not 2,500, 500. It's your proximity to the creek and a bunch of other factors that, again, they haven't fully explained to my satisfaction yet either. As far as reducing risk to try to help pull people out of the floodplain, we certainly do that with a variety of projects, both storm drain projects, improvements to channels, and a variety of other things. Sometimes it takes the form of buyouts to properties that are at extreme flood risk. The Lower Onion Creek neighborhood is a good example of that. And there's various others around town, January, February Drive, Heartwood Drive, several areas where we determined that it was the best option was to actually get those homes out of the floodplain. When we do buyouts, there's usually relocation benefits. So hopefully we're not causing a burden other than the fact that you have to move, but we do our best to help people relocate when that is the option for flood risk mitigation. It's hard to do a big project, like you mentioned, Boggy Creek watershed. There's a big concrete channel there. That was a project that was done primarily by the Corps, but in cooperation, Corps of Engineers, but in cooperation with the City of Austin. Given the rules that we have in place now, we can't go back and make another big concrete channel like that to get lots of people out of the floodplain. We have to do it in different ways that are more friendly to the environment. There's challenges to reducing the size of the floodplain with structural solutions. We do try to do as much of that as we can, but it is expensive and it takes time. Another thing we do is our participation in the FEMA Community Rating System program. So as a benefit of all the various things we do with our floodplain management programs, we can get a slight discount for homeowners and business owners that have flood insurance policies. So that does give folks a little bit of break in certain areas on their flood insurance. So we do what we can to try to reduce that, but we can't completely alleviate the burden of flood insurance, unfortunately.
Thank you.
We do want to thank everybody again for coming out here this morning. We are available to answer questions outside of these webinars. We're happy to talk with you, specifically about your property or answer questions. So please feel free either to call us at this number, 512-974-2843. You'll have to leave a message and then we will call you back. Or you can send us an email at atxfloodplains@austintexas.gov. And you probably aren't going to hear back from us for a while. We will send out a link when we have that presentation available. But the next big push we'll give will be once we have those preliminary maps available. And like Karl had said, it's not going to be until, I think, early 2025, late 2024. Anyways, it will be a while before you hear back with those preliminary maps. And so with that, I guess we hope everyone has a good rest of their day and that you enjoy your weekend. And again, just, please feel free to reach out with us if you have questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
all for attending.